Today I've got a very nice lineup of knives here. These knives are probably the most underappreciated or underutilized knives in the kitchen in my humble opinion. And I didn't really understand how important boning knives were until I actually used them in the capacity that they were designed for. And so I do lots of cutting of meats, ribs, chicken, and filleting salmon on the weekends. That's really when I get to enjoy my time with my knives and my meats. So what I'll do today is I'll go through the different designs that I have here in my studio. Now keep in mind that these designs on these knives are actually not exclusive to these manufacturers. As a matter of fact, both the Shun and the Tojiro actually makes a Western style blade for their knives. So these are just what I have in the studio, and they really are kind of the three basics in terms of what boning knives are. There are some other varying shapes and sizes out there, but these are pretty much what 99% of the people looking for boning knives will look at when they're shopping for a boning knife. Alright, so right here we have the Tojiro. This is the Honosuke 150mm. This knife here is a really interesting knife. This is probably the most, I would say, the most extreme of the knives. Of all the knives here, I think this is the most specialized of the knives. So if you look at the spine of this knife, you see that it's actually quite thick at the top of the spine. It's about 2.5 to 3 millimeters, and then it comes down to a fairly thin tip. And also, you look at the shape, it's a very wedge-shaped knife. This is the most exacting of all the knives. I find that if I'm using this knife here, I can really get into the crevices that I really want to. Of all the meats that I've tried it on, chicken, pork, beef, and fish, really it does well cutting chicken. Because it's designed to go into meat and to kind of power your way through meat, it's very easy to actually push the knife too hard and your hand would actually slip onto the blade itself. That's why when you have a knife that has a higher or taller height, it creates a kind of a barrier between you and the blade. And this is actually very, very important when you're cutting things like chicken, because you get a lot of oils and grease from the chicken meat. So next we are going to look at the Shun. This is the Shun fillet slash boning knife, and this knife here is, as you can see, a very thin blade. Okay, so it's actually quite flexible as well. I wouldn't call this a flexible blade, but relative to the other two, it is kind of flexible. And it also has a really beautiful shape. If you look at this profile, you see that this has a nice swooping profile relative to the other two. Where this knife really shines, I think that this knife really does well cutting fish and filleting fish. When you're cutting meat, especially fish meat, you don't want to have to go back to the same cut and kind of seesaw down that meat. When you do that, you have a higher chance of bruising that meat or kind of separating the meat improperly. So having a knife that gives you the extra length and that curvature to really slice through that meat easily, that is where this knife really shines. And also because of the obvious thinness. I mean, look at this thing. At the thickest point, you're looking at 2 millimeters or so. And by halfway through the knife, the blade, you're looking at 1 millimeters. And then by the time you guys get to the top quarter of the edge of the top tip, you're looking at less than 1 millimeter of thickness. Okay, so it's just a very, very thin knife, very, very fine finesse knife for cutting delicate meats like fish. This is probably the most thinnest knife I have in my studio. So my recommendation is, if you were to get this knife here, consider using it mostly on your fish and using it on beef and steak if you guys were simply slicing meats and keeping it away from bone for as much as you can. The Wusthof here is the most traditional of the knives. This is what you think of when you think of a boning knife. Now in terms of blade design, I think this is the most mobile of all the knives here. It is the only knife that I can really get into a rack of ribs and be comfortably moving around and separating the ribs from the cartilage and from the meat. When I smoke ribs about 2 times a month, I find that this is my go-to knife. It really is easy to go in between the ribs, and it really is easy to go around the bone and pull meat off of the bone. It's heat treated to a 57, and because it is relatively soft, it actually does lend itself to being kind of a worry-free knife. I do cut into bone every once in a while, especially when I'm cutting ribs. It's never chipped, it's never had any sort of damage. And so that's the beauty of having a slightly softer knife and a knife with a low profile, is because you can cut around that bone and really get into the meat and separate things that you guys really want. Even though these are called boning knives, please be reminded that you do not want to cut directly into bone on purpose, okay? If you're cutting meat and you hit a piece of bone, that's fine. If you do it once in a while, it will not hurt your knife. But just make sure that you don't make a habit of cutting into bone on purpose. Now let's look at the handle. So this Tojiro is the Western style handle. This is here is, you know, it's a very good handle. Overall, I find that this handle is very decent. The Tojiro has a palm handle, which is a polyoxymethylene, I think that's what it's called, which is called palm. The shun's handle is actually quite beautiful. It's quite nice. It's very light. It's a very light handle, and because it's actually all wood, you're looking at this ebony pack of wood here. The knife itself is actually quite nimble. The fit and finish of the shun is fantastic. I mean, it is polished from end to end. There is no rough or sharp corners anywhere. Everything is done just right on this knife. The handle itself is actually, it's a D-shaped handle. So this handle here is designed for a right-handed person, but I believe they also make left-handed D handles. The only negative I have to say about this knife or the handle is if your hands were very greasy and you're cutting into something like a piece of chicken, you're trying to push your way through chicken, you can slip a little bit. So with this knife here, it's really best to cut those easy, nice, long strokes of your filleting and your fish. And so you want to just make it easy on yourself with this knife here, because it really is not designed to be a power cutter. You're not going to want to separate bone. You're not going to want to separate shoulder joints with this type of knife. Now, in my opinion, the Wusthof has the most comfortable handle. It's definitely the most ergonomic. I find that just the shape of this handle makes it really easy for hands of any size to use. Even if your hand was a little bit greasy or a little bit oily, you really won't have a issue with your hand slipping. It just shapes so well and so nicely done. And so also this knife here is, it's an ambidextrous type of handle. So whether you're left-handed or right-handed, your hands will feel very much at home on this knife. So no knife review on my channel would be complete without a sharpening talk, okay? So this knife here, the Tojiro, is going to be best used on a whetstone, whether you guys use a 1000 grit or 500 grit stone. You're not going to want to put this on a rod, because a rod typically is better for knives with slight curvature on it. People always ask me, how sharp do you want your knives? Well, the boning knives are the exception to the rule of you wanting it sharp as possible. I find that on a scale of 1 to 10, the boning knives I really keep at a 6 or a 7. When you're cutting into bone, whether by accident or on purpose, the thinner edge you have, the higher chances of you actually having to grab that piece of bone with your edge and chipping your blade. But if you really want to get a higher polished look, then go ahead and go to your 2000 and your 3000. But I would really recommend you not going above 3000 grit. Now the shun is a different type of beast. So in terms of sharpening, this is the most versatile. You can definitely use your honing rods and you can use your whetstones on it. In terms of polishing, yeah, you can definitely go as high as 5000 or 6000 on this, because I'm not cutting into hard bone like chicken or beef or pork. I find that fish bone, even though it might be a tough fish, you will never risk really chipping your knife unless you're cutting into a bluefin tuna. For the Wusthof, I find that this is best used on the honing rod, whether it's ceramic or steel. Because of its shape, it's S-curve shaped here, you do not want to put this on a whetstone. It's virtually impossible to get this part sharpened. Now there's nothing wrong with buying this knife here and then sharpening it on a whetstone. But just keep in mind, if you were to use this on a whetstone, this corner of this knife here will gouge into the top edge of that stone. So just keep that in mind. My recommendation, if you buy this knife here or this type of blade, go for a ceramic rod or a steel rod. Alright guys, that is it for this video. If you guys want to check these knives out, I have linked them in the description so you guys can check them out on your own. And if not, I will see you guys in the next video.